Hello, everybody. I'm Derek Arden, and today I'm delighted to welcome Colonel Brendan Kearney from San Francisco to join us. Let me tell you about Colonel Kearney. Colonel's impressive career culminated as Chief of Staff at Marine Forces Europe, with half of his service spent overseas, including a combat tour to the Persian Gulf during operations Desert Stick, Desert Shield, and Desert Storm. Brendan's appeared in many TV and radio programs, giving his advice and views on political issues, and including the BBC, TV, and radio. Brendan's perspectives are unique and refreshing as opposed to the narrative pushed out by some mainstream media sources. Brendan, welcome to Monday Night Live. Thank you so much for joining us, getting up early in the morning, especially for us. Can you give us a snapshot of your career, please?
Absolutely, Derek. It's a pleasure to be with you and also to meet everybody here on this program, albeit electronically, but that's the best we can do. Born and raised in San Francisco, Irish father from County Cork, Scottish mother from Glasgow, Scotland, that were emigres to the United States. Commissioned in 1975 as a Marine, second lieutenant. Served virtually all over the world as an infantry officer, platoon commander, company commander, operations officer, logistics officer. Fortunate enough to not only command at the company level a couple times, but also a battalion commander in Hawaii and a regimental commander in Okinawa, Japan. Chief of Staff for the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, so I have an awful lot of time, almost 9 years in Asia. But I ended up my career, and it was kind of a nice way to go at as a culmination of 31 years as Chief of Staff of Marine Forces Europe in Stuttgart, Germany for 3 years. And I was the last colonel to be over there as Chief of Staff, where my commanding general was in Norfolk, Virginia. So I led a very, very good life, being far away from the flagpole and getting to pretty much do whatever I wanted within reason. They all kept a nice leash on me, but it was a wonderful job, nice way to go, and because of that, got to spend an awful lot of time, as you would expect, in Europe, serving alongside a number of military organizations, as my responsibility basically stretched from the southern portions of Africa up through Norway and then east into the Republic of Georgia. So that was my career. It was a wonderful time, tremendous education, formal ones with the National War College and at MIT as a fellow. So it really was a pleasure to serve my country, and I still kind of view myself as serving even now, because I've been, through happenstance, fell into this talking head issue with media around the world, and that has forced me to stay current and keeps me professionally aware of what's going on within the American military and also the militaries of our friends and allies around the seas, around the world. Sadly, because we have so many challenges out there, and I think those challenges are going to do nothing except become much more of a challenge, not only to what's left of our generation, but also to our children and grandchildren. So, Derek, I think that sort of summarizes it. I'm happy to go into details.
Brendan, please tell us what's going on in Ukraine. Here we are in Europe, not very far from Ukraine, and I know that you have a different perspective on perhaps what's happening with Putin, etc. Share with us whatever you can, please.
You know, this issue with Ukraine is really it's a sad testimony to history. And I usually start off with any of the presentations I make on Ukraine to, of course, primarily American audiences by saying that one of the real challenges for Europeans is that Europeans have a tremendous sense of history and Americans do not. We're a country that can't remember what happened about a week ago, where the Europeans look at 2,000 years ago and they will go ahead and see that as being something that happened last weekend. So what you see in Ukraine is a culmination of a couple millennia in terms of a relationship between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people that has been fraught with conflict forever. So what we're going to go ahead and see now is this aberration of the Soviet Union that from the 1920s through the early 1990s, where you had this false peace in that part of the world. And now what you see is that the Ukrainian people and the Russian people are at each other's throats. And it's the revenge, the retribution, all of this, as far as they're concerned, might as well have happened last week, as opposed to thousands of years ago. So what we have with Putin is that he is going ahead, as he has publicly stated on numerous occasions, to offset the tragedy of the fall of the Soviet Union, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century in his mind, in order to try to re-achieve Russian greatness. And the way to start achieving Russian greatness is to go ahead and take those portions of Ukraine back and Crimea that are essentially, in his mind, part of this phony political country called Ukraine. And, here he launches this invasion a couple of years ago. 3 days is when he thought his troops would be conducting the victory parade in Kyiv. And that has obviously not taken place. So one of the great miracles, I think, of modern military history is the difference between the Ukrainian military in 2014, when they got their posteriors handed to them by the Russians, and what happened here over the last almost 3 years now, where you see the Ukrainians conducted a brilliant effort at lessons learned from what occurred with them, and the embarrassment, the total embarrassment that the Ukrainian military and their utterly unprofessional performance in 2014, they completely turned that around. And I find that, and we haven't examined that, the Western world hasn't examined that in great detail yet, but what they did is somehow, with the help of the UK, with the United States, primarily American National Guards, and the French, and other countries in Europe, and the Israelis, I believe also, they completely rebuilt their military. They reinstituted or instituted for the first time in their history a non-commissioned officers corps. They empowered their junior officers, and they went ahead and inspired a degree of innovation that when the Russians invaded, they absolutely whacked them, for lack of a technical term, and they are continuing to whack them right up until this day. And I think there's an excellent chance, Derek, and for all the guests here, that, again, not being a complete prognosticator, and I certainly don't have a crystal ball, but the utter failure of the Russian military to execute command and control, to execute aviation superiority over the battlefield, a utterly incompetent logistics system, officers being either dead or incompetent, the ones that still are alive, the most senior leaders, and a non-commissioned officer corps that just has not performed. They have failed at every level, probably one of the greatest military failures in military history. So what we see now is the Ukrainians essentially with the initiative, and of course now we're going to that time of year where we may not see much happen, because once General Mudd starts here in Ukraine with his power, things will slow down in there. It's very, very difficult to fight a winter war in that part of the world, but combat will continue. But I think the bottom line of everything is that we see the Ukrainians with the upper hand right now. We see really the Somme from 1917, 1918 being replayed in trench warfare in that part of the world. And the Ukrainians, I think, just going to go ahead and continue on particularly because of some of the more sophisticated equipment that's been provided to them and the munitions that are being provided to them, and their own innovation. That's the thing that I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate. Their ability to take what's being provided and come up with unique ways to employ these equipments has been astonishing. And I give them all the credit in the world for that. And I know in my heart of hearts that there's a lot of good advice coming from the militaries of the United States, the UK, and the Western friends and allies that have really allowed them to achieve the success that they have. I mean, they have a long way to go. And history has proved that military campaigns can turn around very, very quickly. But I just don't see the Russians being able to turn this into a win for Russia. And I see the Ukrainians being able to go ahead, if the West continues to support, being able to go ahead and eventually, hopefully, turn this into some type of negotiation that will see the hostilities cease in that part of the world. Maybe for a decade or generations or two, and hopefully not to have our grandchildren have to deal with this 20, 30 years down the road again. So that kind of sums it up.
I guess I got a couple of questions for you there. NATO, there's all sorts of issues been happening with NATO. People, clearly the Baltic countries joining NATO, Putin rattling the nuclear cage, which is a bit worrying for those of us that probably only live 1,000 miles away from where Ukraine is. And you may be getting a new president who pulls out. There's 3 questions for you. Sorry.
Well, let's take the last one first. The president of the United States has a very powerful degree of responsibility, and he can do an awful lot of things. But what he has a very hard time doing, and this is any president, rather than just focusing on this personality that we're all so familiar with. He can go ahead and cause all sorts of problems with a treaty obligation like NATO. And it is a treaty obligation. But the real power lies in the Congress of the United States. And if the Congress of the United States objects to anything that any president does when it comes to a treaty alliance, the eventual winner in a conflict, not an immediate one, obviously, in a bureaucratic conflict is what I'm talking about right now, is going to be the Congress. The president can really find, and what I would do is I'd call your attention back to 1975, when President Ford wanted to go ahead and reinforce a U.S. military effort to help, delay or defeat the North Vietnamese invasion into Vietnam in complete violation of the Paris Peace Accords. The Congress basically said no, and they did it because they have the power of the purse. They cut off any possible funding that would allow the United States military to do anything in South Vietnam other than to evacuate the American embassy and take part with some of the humanitarian efforts with the both people. So that's the number one thing to always keep in mind. Now, can a president come in and cause all sorts of heartache and heartburn and discontent within that type of organization? He absolutely can't. But in the long run, he's not going to win if the Congress says no. And I don't think there is, maybe better put, I think there is bipartisan support in the Congress of the United States for NATO. NATO, in spite of it being a very, very difficult organization to work with and disappointing at times to the American public, NATO really has proven itself as an erstwhile organization for the United States to be aligned with. So that's the last question, I think, the last portion of the question, Derek. Moving on just a little bit to NATO, let me address a couple things that I alluded to there. NATO has been disappointing to the United States in for generations, and it's been because of those members of NATO that have just not carried the weight that the other countries, a whole lot of the members, have done in terms of being absolutely fabulous in meeting primarily their financial commitments. And NATO is both a military and a political organization. It is run by the politicians. The NATO Military Committee is subservient to NATO itself. And the relationship between the militaries, for the most part, has been very, very good. I served alongside NATO, obviously, for 3 years when I was in Stuttgart, did an awful lot of work with NATO. And for the most part, it was a very, very satisfying relationship, I think, certainly from the Marine Corps perspective. And of course, I was co-located with the U.S. European Command there in Stuttgart at Patch Barracks. So the frustration has always been, and I think every president, as you can go back as far as Reagan, has expressed a degree of frustration with the failure on some NATO members to simply go ahead and fulfill the commitments that they publicly make in terms of the funding. And so the United States oftentimes had to come up with additional monies, and so did some of the other, this is not just a U.S. only issue, had to come up with funding to help keep that organization going in a manner that made it vibrant. NATO is extremely difficult to work with. The bureaucracy is on a whole level even beyond that of the Pentagon. And I was assigned to the Pentagon a couple of times. And but all the decades and decades upon decades of work in establishing procedures and then being forced to streamline it because of situations like Afghanistan, where there was a NATO commitment there, out of area commitment as it was described, has forced things to be streamlined, and it's actually a much better potential military organization now. If there had to be a NATO response, I think it would be very, very effective and very, very efficient based on where it has evolved to now. And then I'll step back now to one of the things you alluded to, the N word, the nuclear word. And we keep hearing this out of Comrade Putin. I don't believe that he would step into that arena, and there's a couple reasons for it. Number one is the use of tactical nuclear weapons is not a panacea. Those of us who were trained to use them always looked at them as almost being more of a burden. They create huge barriers for both your friendly forces and your opposition forces, your enemy forces, in terms of the no-go areas that very small tactically, but essentially you don't want to go through them. You don't want to operate through them. You were trained to do it, but that's operating in a nuclear, biological, and chemical environment is about the worst environment that any military man would ever want to have to do it. We did it for a very short period of time in the first Gulf War in having to go to what we called MOP 4, which was we were completely kitted out in our NBC suits, gas masks on, and I mean, even though we trained for it, to do it over 3 or 4 days like we were forced to do because we thought the chemicals were loose on the battlefield in southern Kuwait is sheer misery. You do not move quickly, you do not move effectively, you don't communicate quickly or effectively, and that would affect any users or the victims of this type of thing. And on top of that, the other thing here is Mother Nature, as Mother Nature is wont to do, and is shown as repeatedly, she's in charge. And the prevailing winds that may be good during the initial use of nuclear weapons with the fallout going hopefully against your enemy, for the Russians, for most of the times during the year, and you guys, most of you live in Europe, you know this, the winds coming from the east and going, or coming from the west off the Atlantic and blowing east, are going to blow bad things back into Mother Russia. And Putin can't, Their civil defense system is as gooned up as their military is. They are going to be completely incapable of handling the type of disasters that would be associated with the use of nuclear weapons. So I think for those primary reasons, both tactical nukes and the bigger ones, I don't think he's going to do it. And I'm not sure that what is left of his supporters at the most senior levels, those that are still alive and not falling off of buildings over there in Moscow, I don't think they would allow him to do it. I just don't see it. And I hope I'm not proven wrong on this one. I can be proven wrong and happily get smarter on a whole lot of issues associated with the military campaigns around the world. But this is one I just don't see him doing it, and I hope I'm not proven wrong. So I think I've addressed everything, Derek, and hopefully I did.
Before we move on to Israel, which is maybe an even more difficult situation to ask you about, how does Putin pull back out of this without losing face? Or perhaps he doesn't.
I think you hit the nail on the head right there with your statement. I'm not sure that he can pull out and remain in power. I think there's clearly we've seen there is a nationalistic streak in Russia that absolutely supports any military activity whatsoever in Ukraine, also in some other parts of Eastern Europe, to again reestablish that Russian Empire. You know, the Baltics are a thorn in their side from, again, a Russian view of history. And again, it's a Russian view of history that we're talking about. He could go today, he could go tomorrow or a year from now, or may hang around for a while longer. Not only those questions about his own health, but these periodic intel, this vague intel reporting that we see in the open press that talks about maybe a coup is being planned over there. We don't know. I mean, none of the Western countries have nearly the embassy, and of course we read with any embassy presence, some intelligence presence. We simply don't have that in Moscow anymore like we used to have. Even during the Cold War, we had a greater intelligence presence in Moscow than we have now. And likewise, the Russians have a resulting very reduced presence in Washington, D.C. and the Western capitals because of, again, a lot of their intelligence agents being thrown out and their diplomats being thrown out of the Western capitals. So we don't have a good view of them, and likewise, they don't have a very good view of us, which is probably not very helpful. So that's my phone acting up there. Sorry about that.
No problem. Can we move on to Israel and what's going on in Israel, which seems to get worse by the day? Brendan, what's your take on this difficult situation?
Well, it is an extraordinarily difficult situation, and it's been one that's been a bother to all of us and a sadness to all of us since the founding of the Israeli state. This era of conflict has just continued on. There's been hope at different times with the Egyptian peace accords and obviously with Jordan playing a very influential role there in that part of the world. But, here we are since October 7th, where we've had this terrible humanitarian conflict going on in Gaza with Hamas. And Israel, in my mind, has clearly achieved a militarily upper hand in Gaza. And they now are turning their attention towards Hezbollah in Lebanon. We have to keep in mind that Hezbollah has been, since the very get-go, in violation of the UN Accords from 2006, that last period of extended conflict, which essentially banned all Hezbollah activity south of the Litani River in southern Jordan. They ignored that. And that's where the majority of the missiles that Hezbollah has been launching against Israel, primarily northern Israel, since October the 7th, have been coming from. And I think Israel was biding its time with its focus, with just periodically whacking back at Lebanon, at southern Lebanon, at Hezbollah. They've gone ahead and they've now prepared themselves with this absolutely superb intelligence victory over the last couple of weeks with this pager effort and the walkie-talkie effort, and clearly an understanding of Hezbollah leadership that tells me, and I obviously have no insights whatsoever other than instincts based on 50 years of study, that the Israelis, have penetrated the most senior levels of Hezbollah leadership and also other Muslim organizations in southern Lebanon, or Lebanon writ large, and have really taken out, they have decapitated Hezbollah. I think what we're going to see next is, first of all, a continuation of the Israeli aerial campaign. And I see the Israelis launching a series of ground raids, and that's what they're going to be, raids into southern Lebanon that are going to eliminate, their purpose will be to eliminate the launching sites for these primarily missiles, and also the storage areas for the missiles. They'll concurrently, I think, continue to hit hard into Syria, because that's where there's also stockpiles of these things that Iran has provided in terms of the monies for purchase, but also in the shipments of these weapon systems. And they're going to go in. The difference is I don't see them going in and wanting to stay at all. I think Israel has learned its lesson about having an extended presence in Lebanon. It has not turned out well for them any of the times that they've gone in and stayed for a while. So I see this as being a series of raids that they'll conduct at a time and place of their choosing that will go in. And of course, the big delta, the big question mark is, what is Iran going to do? And I think there it's going to be more puffery. It's going to be a lot of noise. They may fire some missiles, but it will be to maintain what they desire, what the Iranians desire, is this image of being a tremendous power broker in the Middle East, and they are. But I think the Israelis are going to be quietly signaling through intermediaries to the Iranians that their oil fields, their military, are extremely vulnerable to a significant Israeli strike. And the Israelis will hold back in that unless they're forced into a position that they feel they have to respond. And then who knows what happens then.
Wow. Wow. You must have been in some pretty tricky negotiations in your career. As you know, I write about negotiations and have a bit of fun. What's the biggest meeting that you've ever been in that people were trying to sort things out?
Oh, easily. Easily it was I was personally involved in the negotiations between the U.S. government and the Japanese government in the 90s, late 90s. And what made it so difficult is that we had a situation that occurred in Okinawa, Japan, where there was what I've described to other Americans as the most expensive rape since that of Helen of Troy. And sadly, there was a rape. 3 American service members raped a young Japanese schoolgirl. Thankfully, she lived, and she was not obviously violated, but she was not badly hurt in the sense of being, violently brutalized. It was bad, but it caused a whole series of issues between the Okinawans, who are not ethnically Japanese, the Japanese government, which obviously wants to maintain a security relationship with the United States, and then the United States government that, quite frankly, our approach was one that was completely disjointed. You had the Department of Defense and the Department of State at odds over how to solve these issues with maintaining the U.S. military presence not only in Okinawa but also in mainland Japan. And of course, the impact that would have around the entire Western Pacific, all of Asia Pacific is what we've seen go. And this was all done at a time where the United States was absolutely enamored with China. To criticize anything that had to do with the U.S. relationship with China in those days was just a fight worth, was in my mind, a fight worth fighting, because most of us that had had any dealings with the Chinese saw them as being arrogant and looking for a down the road series of fisticuffs. We saw this coming, but boy, I tell you, if you tried to raise that type of comment in the Pentagon, you'd be shut down, marginalized, ostracized, whatever you want, and told not to come back for a while, which may have been good. But those were by far the toughest negotiations, and really the tough negotiation part, Derek, and you're involved in this business, was within our own side, was the U.S. side itself trying to come to a consensus, and we never really did, as to how we should deal with the Japanese and then deal with the Okinawans. Because sadly, the Japanese had a very similar problem, is that they were dealing with the prefecture, their equivalent of a state of Okinawa, that saw things entirely differently than the Japanese central government did. And in many respects, the Japanese central government was frustrated because the American military had a better relationship with the Okinawan people than their own government did, because we'd been there since 1945 and have tremendous relationships, even among the people that the Okinawan people that would prefer that we went away. They're some of the best friends in the world. They just happen to disagree, although now I think many of them see the wisdom of the security relationship, because Okinawa, Naha, the capital city of Okinawa, the prefectural capital, is a 1-hour flight from Taipei. The stuff going on with the Chinese is in the backyard of the Okinawans, and they're worried about it. They're very worried about it.
Brendan, we've really come to the end of our time for the recording. That was absolutely fascinating. I've been making lots and lots of notes, and I did want to talk to you about World War II, because I know you're an expert on that. But would you come back later in the year or first thing next year and talk to us about some of the experiences that you've researched on World War II, please?
Absolutely. I'd love to do it. I'd love to do it. I enjoy talking about this, and as I mentioned to you, this being essentially fully retired, this allows me to go ahead and stay current, and that's my motivation. I enjoy it. It's my passion, and I'm always happy to share with like-minded people. So I'm willing to learn. Boy, I learn something new every day.
Well, that's one of the things about the people on here, Brendan. We're all lifelong learners. We know that we've got to keep up and we've got to keep on the pace. And I'm delighted that you told me that the BBC radio and TV is one of the nicest channels to get a call from, I think.
They're extraordinarily professional. They're not only the producers that I deal with, but also the interviewers themselves. Superb questions, well prepared, which is, I won't name names, but maybe not quite the case with some of their American counterparts.
Can I ask members of Monday Night Live to give Brendan the usual vote of applause and thank you for it?
Thank you.
Will you stay on for a little while and answer a few questions for us?
Yes, I can. I'm good until the top of the hour when I've got to get off. But I'm good till then.
Okay, I'll just close the recording down. That's fantastic. Thank you.